Hey y'all, Big Tim here. Thanks for tuning in for the very first edition of the Truth Behind the Trophy series. So I've wrestled with this for a while. I didn't really know how to start the series. Do I start with what I think is my favorite story and build up? Or do I start, from the bottom and work my way up? I finally decided to do it chronologically. So we're going to start with my first trophy that I ever won regionally. This is a KBF tournament on Lake Barkley. Now, I'd won some club tournaments before then, but this is my first regional win. This is April 29th, 2007 on Lake Barkley. So this tournament was the first tournament of the year for KBF, which is odd because most of the time the KBF has some tournaments in early April and even March. But this one was the very first one, and it was April 29th, late in the season. Well, in those days, all the Kentucky Bass Federation, or KBF as we called it, all the KBF tournaments were on Sundays. So a lot of people would take Friday off and Saturday to go practice. Well, for some reason, my new travel partner and I, we weren't able to get off Friday. I can't remember if it was because I had to work or if he had to work or what, but we didn't get to leave Friday. We left early Saturday morning. Really, actually not all that early. We probably left here about 8 o'clock. Remember, we got to the lake about 12:30. So we had a couple hours of practice because you had to be at a KBF meeting at that time by about 5:30, if I remember correctly. So we didn't have a lot of time to get practice in. We wanted to stop and go fish for a little bit, but we also had to go find our hotel room and get all that squared away before the meeting. That's kind of the way I like to do things. Once the meeting's over, I like to have everything finished. I just want to be able to relax. That's always been my key in all my tournaments. I generally have all my tackle prepped. I have already eaten dinner. Once the meeting's done, maybe it's time for a cold adult beverage. I don't know. But most of the time, we're doing nothing. So anyway, we only had a couple hours to practice. And we launched where, I'm generally more familiar with. We were going out of Catawba there at Barkley, and my club had spent a lot of time on Eddy Creek. So that's where our tournaments launched out of. That's what I'm familiar with, so that's where we went. Now, I fished a couple of places in Eddy Creek that I'd always looked at but never really had time to fish. So we took the opportunity to go there and caught a few fish on spinnerbait. We had some decent quality fish, some 2s and 3s. Granted, I know this time of year, generally the pattern is look for the yellow flowers and go fish there. And you're looking for 4-pound plus. But for me, I hadn't really ever done all that well in any Bass Federation tournaments. So, for me to catch some good 2, 2.5, and 3-pounders, I felt good. My first thing that I wanted to do was weigh limit, and then after that, who knows? So, like I said, we had a limited practice, but it seemed pretty decent. So the next day rolls around, we had a little bit of a cold front overnight. The temperature dropped fairly significantly. It was a little cool, but it wasn't freezing. It was decent considering it's the end of April. So I remember we were waiting to launch, and one of my friends, who doesn't even remember this fact, that his rod lockers wouldn't open. I don't remember if they were locked shut and he'd lost the key. I don't remember why they wouldn't open. At first I thought they were frozen, but it wasn't cold enough for them to freeze shut. But anyway, he couldn't open his rod lockers, and he was like, man, I can't fish. So I lent him about 3 of my rods. Now granted, I didn't give him the best of the best that I was going to use, but there were at least 2 rods in there that I had planned on using that day. So, I figured he didn't have anything. Let's let him have an opportunity at least. So then we launched and blasted off there and ran out of Catawba and down to Eddy Creek. And I went to a little place that I'm real familiar with. My dad had actually caught like 19 pounds off of this bank a couple years prior on a spinnerbait. So that's what I thought I'd do. And when I got there, there were some fish there. I think I had a 5 off of it right away, and a couple small, just 15 inchers. So I felt pretty good. I think I had 3 or 4 fish. Then I went to another little bank where some bushes are and thought maybe there might be a bush bite going. And did some flipping and threw the spinnerbait in there. Before I knew it, I hit a limit. Now, it was a small limit, real small limit. Maybe 10 pounds, maybe 11. But one of those fish was a 5. So I felt pretty good about that. In those days, the KBF was a shared boat event. And my co-angler that I drew, and I shouldn't even say co-angler because they used to call them non-boaters. The non-boater that I drew was a young boy. I think he was just barely 16. Really good kid. But he was a little reluctant on taking the front of the boat. Finally, about lunchtime, I pulled into a little spot and I told him, I said, I don't catch a lot of fish, or I don't catch a lot of keepers here, but I do catch a lot of fish. I told him, take the front of the boat, try to catch some fish here. He didn't have anything. I had 5 and he didn't have any. So he flipped around there for a little bit. He threw a spinnerbait and he couldn't come up with anything. And meanwhile, I'm in the back seat eating my sandwich. Like I said, I've got my limit, so I'm kind of relaxing a little bit. And I asked him, I said, did you flip here? Yeah, did you flip here? He said, yeah. And I watched him one time. He flipped the bait in there and didn't get bit. So I finished up my sandwich and he said, well, I'm going to sit down for a second. So I stood on the front deck, and one of the places that I just literally watched him flip into, I flipped my baby brush hog in there. Pumpkin baby brush hog with a 1/4 ounce weight. Not green pumpkin, pumpkin. And when I set the hook, a 4+ came out. And he was like, oh my God, I just threw in there. And I'm like, yeah, I know, I saw you. I watched you throw in there, but you didn't get bit, and I did. So I kept asking him if he fished all these little places. And it was a weird little tree line that was giving you about 3 feet of shade on the surface of on the bank of the water. And that 3 feet was a big deal. Like I said, it's lunchtime, it's 12:30, it's 1 o'clock, something like that. But I ended up calling everything that I had out of that little pocket on that baby brush hog. And Michael had already fished the whole bay and couldn't catch them. Though I don't know if they just pulled up in there because of the shade. I don't know if it was just my bait and the way I was working it. But the one thing that Michael was doing different than I was, we were both throwing a baby brush hog. We were both throwing pumpkin. We were both throwing a 1/4 ounce weight. But my weight was painted black. His was silver. And he could not get bit. And I kept telling him, Michael, try this. Get one of these black weights, and he wouldn't do it. I even offered him my rod. Dude, take my rod. He wouldn't do it. So like I said, I'd called everything out. And by this point, I was like, I think I need to be starting to concern myself about winning this tournament. So I went to a couple other places and tried some other things and really couldn't upgrade. I caught a few more fish, but couldn't upgrade. And at this point, Michael's getting aggravated. He's all about those yellow flowers. Let's go to the yellow flowers. Come on, let's go to the yellow flowers. So I took him to the yellow flowers. He did end up catching one on a fluke, I believe it was. And that was it. He had one keeper. So we went back to weigh in, and he was pretty dejected. And I didn't feel great. I didn't feel like I had the thing won. I knew I had a pretty good bag. In fact, it was the best bag that I'd ever had to that point. And when we got back to the weigh-in, I weighed my fish, and I had 1797. That's the biggest bag I ever had, almost 18 pounds. And I thought, well, this 18 pounds is good. I might finish in the top 5 or 10. But I'm not going to win this tournament. No way. I had no idea about winning. And I finally sat there and watched most of the tournament because I was one of the first guys to weigh in. And one of my old friends, Keith, who is no longer with us, Keith and I had a friendly little rivalry. Keith and I had fished together I think might have been the year before, if not 2 years before. We got paired on a boater draw, and we hit it off, and we were kind of friendly. Now, anybody that knows Keith knows that a lot of people didn't understand him. He was a difficult person to get to know. But Keith and I really struck up a friendship. And our rivalry was always, who was going to get who. And by some small miracle, I beat Keith that day. I finished first with 1797. And Keith finished second with 1726. And it's all because of that little pumpkin baby brush hog. So I hope you enjoyed this little story. We got more coming. Please tune in. I think you're going to enjoy what we've got in store for you. We'll see you next time.